The cold air of the hospital felt heavy as Dr. Joana hurried down the hallway. Her pager had gone off in the middle of the night. A critically injured patient was being rushed into surgery. She was one of the best trauma surgeons in Lagos, and time was of the essence. Joana adjusted her mask as she entered the emergency room, prepared for the routine rush of saving a life. But as she glanced at the patient lying on the stretcher, her heart stopped. It was Manel, the man who had broken her heart 5 years ago, the man who disappeared without a word, leaving her shattered and confused. She felt frozen, unable to move as nurses and doctors crowded around him, shouting about his injuries. Joanna's mind raced. How could it be him? Why now? She has spent years trying to forget about Manel, to bury the pain deep down inside. And now, here was he, lying on a hospital bed, his life hanging by a thread. A voice broke through her shock. Doctor, we need you. Joanna snapped back into action, her hands trembling as she grabbed her gloves. This was her job. She had to save him. But could she do it? Could she save the man who had broken her heart? As the doors to the operating room swung open, Joanna's emotions surged, leaving her torn between duty and the pain of her past. Would she be able to save Manel, or would the wound he caused her resurface at the worst possible moment? Joanna's hand moved mechanically as she scrubbed in for surgery. Her mind, however, was far from the hospital, swelling in a haze of painful memory she had long buried. The first time she met Manel flashed back before her eyes. The way he smiled at her during a medical seminar, his charm, his passion, he had swept her off her feet, made her feel like the most important person in the world. But then, just as suddenly as he entered her life, he vanished. No explanation, no goodbye. She had come home one day to find his things gone. His phone was unreachable, his social media wiped clean. It was as if he had never existed. For months, Joanna searched for answers, but all she found was an unbearable emptiness. The heartbreak consumed her, making it difficult to trust anyone again. And now here he was. She felt her heart pounded in her chest as she entered the operating room, where Manel lay unconscious on the table. His face was bruised and blooded, his body broken from whatever horrific accident he had encountered. But beneath all the injuries, it was unmistakably him, the man she had loved so deeply. She glanced at the other surgeons and nurses who were preparing for the operation, their focus solely on saving his life. They didn't know her history with Manel. To them, he was just another patient. But to Joanna, he was a painful reminder of her past. As the anesthesiologist confirmed Manel was being sedated, Joanna took a deep breath and prepared herself. She couldn't let her emotion get in the way. She had a job to do. But as she looked down at him, her heart ached with the weight of unresolved pain. Scrapper, she said, her voice steady but her mind racing. Could she truly save the man who had once destroyed her? The surgery was intense. Manel had multiple broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a head surgery that required immediate attention. Joanna's hands worked swiftly and efficiently, but every time she looked at his face, a wave of memories crashed over her. She thought she had moved on. She had built a successful career, surrounded herself with friends, and even dated casually. But seeing Manel again made her realize that the scars he left behind had never fully healed. As the operation continued, the machines around him beeped with urgency. Manel's condition was worse than she had initially thought. His heart rated with unstable, and the internal bleeding was more severe than they had anticipated. Doctors, his vitals are dropping, one of the nurses shouted. Manel's pulse quickened. She couldn't let him die. Not like this. Her instinct took over her as she instructed the teams to stabilize his blood pressure while she worked to stop the bleeding. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she fought to save him. After what felt like hours, they finally got the bleeding under control. Manel's heart rate stabilized, but he wasn't out of danger yet. "Let's close him up," Joana said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she finished the procedure. When the surgery was over, Joana stepped out of the operating room, peeling off her gloves and mask. Exhaustion hit her like a wave, but it wasn't just from the surgery. It was from the emotional toll of seeing Manel again. She sat down in the hallway, her mind still reeling. Was this fate? Was there a reason he had come back into her life like this? Or was it just a cruel twist of fate, forcing her to confront the pain she has tried so hard to forget? The hospital was quieter now, the furore of the emergency over. Manel was stable, resting in the intensive care unit, but Joana felt anything but calm. She paced outside his room, glancing through the window at him lying unconscious in the bed. Seeing him so vulnerable, so broken, made something stir inside her. She wasn't sure if it was anger, sadness or pity, or perhaps a mix of all three. Part of her wanted to confront him the moment he woke up, to demand answer why he had left. Why had he shattered her heart without so much as a word? But another part of her was terrified. What if his explanation wasn't enough? What if she couldn't handle the truth? She sat down in the chair by his bedside, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. His face was still bruised, but there was a peacefulness of his expression now that hadn't been there before. He looked different, more worn, as though life had taken toll on him too. Joana thought back to the years after he left. She had been devastated, but eventually she had forced herself to move on. She had built walls around her heart, determined never to let anyone hurt her that way again. But now those walls were crumbling, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face what lay beneath. 2 days later, Manel woke up. Joana wasn't in the room when it happened, but a nurse called her immediately. She hesitated before going to see him, her heart pounding as she made her way to the ICU. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She would have to face him, to look into the eyes of the man who had hurt her so deeply. As she entered the room, Manel's eyes were open. He looked weak, his body still recovering, but there was a glimmer of recognition in his gaze as he saw her. "Joana," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She froze, standing in the doorway, unsure of what to say. Her emotions were a storm inside her. Anger, confusion, sadness, and something else she couldn't quite name. "I never thought I would see you again," he continued, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm so sorry." Joana felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but the words couldn't come. Instead, she simply stood there, watching as Manel struggled to speak. "I need to tell you the truth," he said, his voice weak but determined, "about why I left, about everything." Joana's heart raced. What could he possibly say that would make up the years of silence, the pain he had caused? She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "I'm listening," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And as Manel began to speak, Joana knew that her life was about to change forever. Manel's breathing was shallow as he struggled to find the right words. Joana sat at the edge of her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with anticipation. She had spent years wondering why he had left, why he had abandoned her without a word. Now, finally, she was about to get the answer. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," Manel began, his voice shaky. "I was forced to." Joana frowned, her confusion deepening. Forced to leave? It didn't make sense. She had been there, waiting for him to return home, only to find everything gone. She remembered calling his family, his friends, and even the police, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. "What do you mean, first?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Manel swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if he were confused someone might be listening. "I was involved in something dangerous, Joana, and I couldn't drag you into it." Joanna's heart sank. Dangerous? She had never known Manel to be involved with anything shady. He was a medical student, just like her. What could have possibly been so dangerous that he felt the need to disappear? "What are you talking about, Manel? You were studying medicine. How could you be involved in something dangerous?" she demanded, her frustration growing. Manel closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to continue. "It wasn't what you think. I got mixed up with some people I should never have trusted. It started off small, just favors, errands, but before I knew it, I was in too deep." Joanna's mind raced. Who were these people, and why had Manel kept this from her? "I tried to get out, but they wouldn't let me. I didn't have a choice, Joana. They threatened to hurt you if I didn't leave. I had to go. It was the only way to protect you," Manel said, his voice breaking. Joana felt her stomach drop. All these years, she had believed that Manel had left her because he didn't love her. But now, hearing this, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Could she really believe him, or was this just another excuse? "And you couldn't tell me any of this?" Joana asked, her voice trembling with hurt. "You just disappeared, and I was left with nothing." "I thought it was the only way," Manel replied, his eyes filled with regret. "I was trying to keep you safe." Joana sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to think. Could she forgive him? Could she ever trust him again? "I don't know what to say, Manel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice cracking. "But I need you to know the truth. I never stopped loving you, Joana, not for a second." The weight of his words hung in the air, but Joana couldn't bring herself to respond. There were too many unanswered questions, too much pain to process. She stood up abruptly, and her hands shaking. "I need some time to think," she said, her voice distant. Before Manel could say another word, Joana walked out of the room, her heart heavy with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. Joana couldn't stop thinking about what Manel had told her. His confession haunted her thoughts, making it impossible for her to focus on anything else. At the hospital, she threw herself into her work, trying to drown out the noise in her head. But no matter how hard she tried, the memories of their time together, both good and bad, kept surfacing. She replayed his words over and over in her mind. Manel had claimed that he had left to protect her, but could she really believe him? After all, he had stayed away for years, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her broken heart, and now he was back, asking for forgiveness. Joana wasn't sure if she could give him what he was asking for. At home, she found herself pacing back and forth, her thoughts racing. She hadn't told anyone about Manel's reappearance. Her friends and colleagues didn't know the full story of her past with him, and she wasn't ready to open up about it just yet. It was too raw, too confusing. As the days passed, Joana avoided visiting Manel in the hospital. She knew he was recovering, but she couldn't bring herself to face him again. Every time she thought about him, a flood of emotions threatened to overwhelm her. One evening, as she sat on her couch, staring blankly at the television, her phone rang. It was Dr. Onu, her colleague from the hospital. "Joana, I just want to give you an update on your patient, Manel," Dr. Onu said. "He's been asking for you." Joana felt her heart skip a beat. "How is he doing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's stable, but he's still weak. He's asked to see you several times," Dr. Onu continued. "I think it would do him some good if you visited." Joana hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to see Manel again, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her chest. She needed answers more than what Manel had already given her. "I will come by tomorrow," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Great, I'm sure he will appreciate that," Dr. Onu replied before hanging up. Joana set her phone down and leaned back on the couch, her mind racing. Tomorrow, she would face him again, and this time, she would demand the full truth. The next day, Joana stood outside Manel's hospital room, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't seen him since he had confessed the truth, and she wasn't sure how she would feel when she walked through the door. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Manel was sitting up in bed, looking much better than he was few days ago. His face still bore the bruises from the accident, but his eyes were clear, and there was a softness in his expression when he saw her. "Joana," he said, his voice weak but full of emotion. Joana didn't respond right away. She stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed, her heart aching with a mix of emotions. "We need to talk," she finally said, her voice firm. Manel nodded, his expression serious. "I know. I need to know everything, Manel. The truth, the full truth," Joana continued, her voice trembling slightly. "No more half answers, no more excuses. Why did you leave, and why did you never come back?" Manel sighed, his eyes darkening as he looked down at his hands. "I didn't come back because I couldn't. The people I was involved with, they wouldn't have let me. They were dangerous, Joana. They controlled every aspect of my life for years." Joanna's chest tightened. "And what about now? Are you still in danger?" Manel hesitated before shaking his head. "No, not anymore. I've spent the last few years trying to get out, trying to make things right, but it took time." Joana felt a lump form in her throat. "And you never thought to reach out to me, even once?" "I wanted to," Manel said, his voice cracking, "but I was afraid. Afraid of what you would think. Afraid that I had hurt you too much." Joana closed her eyes, her emotions swelling inside her. She wanted to believe him, but the pain of the past was still so fresh. Could she really forgive him? Could she let go of the hurt he had caused? "I don't know if I can do this, Manel," Joana whispered, her voice breaking. Manel looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I understand if you can, but I just need you to know that I am sorry for everything." Joana stood there, her heart heavy with indecision. She had spent years trying to move on from Manel, and now he was back, asking for a second chance. But was she ready to give it to him? As the silence stretched between them, Manel realized that the answer wasn't simple. There was so much left unsaid, so much pain that still lingered. And as she turned to leave the room, she couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the end of their story, or was it just the beginning of something new? Joana couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Manel's face appeared before her, his expression filled with regret, his voice pleading for forgiveness. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying the conversation they had earlier. Why was this so hard? Why couldn't she just walk away from him for good? As morning light crept into her room, Joana finally gave in. She needed to clear her head. She dressed quickly and headed out, hoping that a walk around the city would help her think. Lagos was already bustling, the street full of life and noise, but Joana barely noticed it. Her mind was far away, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and unresolved emotions. When she returned to her apartment later that day, she found an envelope waiting for her on the doormat. It was plain, with her name scrawled in a familiar handwriting. She knew instantly it was from Manel. Her heart raced as she tore it open. Inside was a letter, his final plea. "Joana, I know you said you need time, but I can't leave things like this. You deserve to know everything. If you are willing to hear me out one more time, I'll be waiting at the cafe where we used to go. Please, just give me one last chance to explain everything. Manel." Joanna's hands trembled as she read the letter. Part of her wanted to crumple it up and throw it away, to forget that Manel had ever re-entered her life. But another part of her, one that she had hated to admit, wanted to go. She wanted to hear him out. The next thing she knew, Joana was at the cafe, her heart pounding in her chest as she spotted Manel sitting at a corner table, looking as if he hadn't slept either. His eyes met hers, and for a second, neither of them spoke. Finally, Joana broke the silence. "You said you wanted to explain." Manel nodded, taking a deep breath before he began. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Joana, but I need to tell you the whole truth." Joana crossed her arms, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'm listening." Manel's eyes darkened as he started to speak. "The people I got involved with, they were dangerous, really dangerous. I was a fool to think I could handle it. But by the time I realized what I've gotten myself into, it was already too late. They controlled everything, where I went, who I talked to. If I tried to leave, they threatened to hurt the people I cared about." Joana felt a chill run down her spine. "And you thought disappearing was the only way to protect me?" "It wasn't just that," Manel said, his voice shaking. "They forced me into things, Joana. Things I never wanted to do. When I finally broke free, I didn't want you to see the mess I've become. I thought I was protecting you by staying away, but I was a coward. I should have come to you sooner." Joanna's heart ached as she listened to him. Could she really believe him? Could she trust that he had stayed away for her sake and not because he didn't care? "What kind of things did they force you to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Manel hesitated, pain flickering in his eyes. "I don't want to drag you into that world, Joana. It's not safe. But I promise you, I tried to keep you out of it. I did everything I could to protect you." Joana shook her head, her emotions swelling inside her. "I don't know what to believe, Manel. How could I trust you after everything?" Manel leaned forward, his voice pleading. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm not the same man who left. I spent years trying to fix my mistakes, and I will do whatever it takes to make things right with you." Joana felt tears pricked in her eyes. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man he had once loved was still in there, somewhere. But the scars of the past ran deep, and she wasn't sure if she could let him back in. "I need time," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Manel nodded, his eyes filled with pain. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here waiting. Just know that I never stopped loving you." Joana stood up, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. She didn't know what to say, so she just turned and walked away, leaving Manel sitting alone at the table. As she stepped out into the street, she realized that she wasn't just still as confused as before. A few days passed, and Joana did her best to carry on with her life. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on her work, her thoughts kept drifting back to Manel. She hadn't made up her mind about him yet, but the fact that he was still in her life after all this time unsettled her. One evening, as she was about to leave the hospital after a long shift, she noticed a familiar figure waiting by her car. It was Manel. Joanna's heart sank. What was he doing here? She had told him she needed time, so why was he showing up unannounced? "What are you doing here?" Joana asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "I had to see you," Manel replied, his expression tense. "There is something you need to know." Joana crossed her arms, already feeling defensive. "I thought we already said everything that needed to be said." "It's not about me," Manel said, his voice urgent. "It's about you." Joana frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Manel took a step closer, his eyes scanning the area as if checking to make sure no one was watching. "The people I was involved with, they have been asking questions about you. I think you might be in danger." Joanna's blood ran cold. "Danger? What do you mean?" "I don't know about all the details, but I've heard rumors. They know you were important to me, and they're not happy that I've been trying to get out. I think they are going to try to use you to get to me," Manel explained, his voice filled with urgency. Joanna's heart pounded in her chest. Could this really be happening? After everything, was she now a target because of Manel's past? "What are you saying, Manel? What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You need to be careful," Manel warned. "Watch your back, and whatever you do, Don't trust anyone who tries to get closer to you. Joana felt a wave of fear washed over her. This was all too much. First, Manel had shattered her heart, and now he was bringing danger into her life. I can't believe this, Joana muttered, shaking her head. I'm sorry, Joana. I never wanted this for you, Manel said, his eyes filled with guilt. Joana didn't know what to say. The situation had spiraled out of control, and she wasn't sure if she could handle it. As she stood there, grappling with the gravity of what Manel had just told her, she realized that this nightmare was far from over, and the worst part was she had no idea what was coming next.